wages.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member.
They have much work to do.
Order. I call Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise on behalf of the Green Party to speak to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Covered Bonds Amendment Bill. The Green Party will be supporting this legislation, even though we have some significant concerns about it. One way to think about this legislation is that it's kind of like the equivalent of raising the private debt ceiling for New Zealand. There's been a lot of debate in the United States about raising the debt ceiling for borrowing by the US government. I think it's something in the order of $16 trillion at the moment. Likewise, in Australia at the moment there's a very lively debate because the Conservative Party over there want to increase the debt ceiling of the Australian government to 500 billion Australian dollars. And the Greens have been resisting that, suggesting it should be a lower debt ceiling of 400. But in some senses, what the Covered Bonds Bill does is it regulates a sector which enables the New Zealand private sector economy to borrow even more. It regulates that kind of borrowing and essentially facilitates more borrowing. So while it's a necessary step, and we'll be supporting it for that reason, we should admit and kind of recognise the underlying addiction to debt for the New Zealand economy that this bill is really a reflection of. Essentially, it is like raising the private debt ceiling for the New Zealand economy as a whole, because what it says is that New Zealand runs these huge current account deficits. It has this massive external debt, somewhere in the order of $260 billion now in gross terms, and the plan looking forward is to increase the debt and not to pay our way in the world. That's this government's plan. So the government's plan is very large current account deficits, currently of the order of 4.3% of GDP, second largest in the OECD after Turkey. And so New Zealand runs these very large current account deficits. In order to finance these current account deficits, we either borrow from offshore or we sell assets. And New Zealand currently does a mixture of both, so we're slowly selling off our productive land into overseas ownership. Most of the large corporations have already been sold into overseas ownership, and look at the banking sector for the obvious example of that, and telecommunications is a similar story. And then the other part of it is we just borrow from offshore, and the banks are the mechanism essentially to do that. So the banks do most of the borrowing and then channel it into the New Zealand economy. Now what this bill does is regulate a part of the bank's borrowing, the covered bonds section. So the banks borrow offshore using these covered bonds mechanisms in order to lend into the New Zealand economy and increase the debt of the New Zealand economy as a whole. So yes, it's good that we're regulating this sector, but surely alongside the regulating of this borrowing problem that the New Zealand economy has, we should also have a plan to get ourselves out of constantly having to borrow from offshore in order to pay our bills. Now, unfortunately, while this government came into office, and Bill English said some really important things about trying to rebalance the economy, where he recognised this problem. He said the international debt is the single biggest threat facing the New Zealand economy, and of course it's the current account deficit that sits behind the growth of that international debt. And Bill English talked a lot about trying to get a balance put between the tradable and the non-tradable sectors so that New Zealand could trade its way out of its debt position. But as he's failed to achieve that goal, which was a very sensible goal, he no longer talks about it. And so when we look at the difference between the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector, what we're finding is that the tradable sector is continuing to flatline in New Zealand. And that means that we can't solve the debt problem. And so because we can't trade our way out of it, we're continuing to borrow offshore in order to finance this debt problem we have. And once we go, OK, there's no plan from the government to get ourselves out of increasing our borrowing and increasing our foreign debt. In fact, the government has a plan to increase the debt. Then you go, OK, well, if the government's plan is to increase the debt, then what we need is a mechanism to regulate and facilitate this dramatic increase in debt that the New Zealand economy is loading up. And that's what this bill does. This bill provides a way whereby the banks can go to the offshore lenders and say, we want to borrow more money to loan into New Zealand, but in order to do that, what we'll do is we'll give you first bid on home mortgages in New Zealand. So if one of these Australian-owned banks that are operating in New Zealand goes belly up, it will be the foreign lenders who get the first bite of the cherry at the carcass of the Australian bank when it rolls over. And it's on that basis that the foreign lenders will keep lending into the New Zealand economy. I mean, that's the fundamental principle that sits behind the Covered Bonds Bill. It means that if one of the Australian banks goes belly up, if you're a depositor in that bank, you won't get your money until the foreign lender gets their money, because they essentially are first in the queue as a result of this bill. Now, that has a certain logic to it, because we're trying to facilitate the constant flow of foreign lending into the New Zealand economy, and this bill provides a way to facilitate that and try to decrease the cost of that lending by providing security to those overseas lenders. But what it means is that depositors in New Zealand Bank are now not at the front of the queue. It is the foreign lenders who are at the front of the queue when it comes to getting access to the assets if one of those banks goes belly up. Now, you might say, well, if we're a country which is constantly borrowing, this is just what we have to do, and there's a logic to that. I appreciate that, and that's why we're voting for it. But surely this should make us look at our economic strategy as a country and go, well, isn't it funny that we're sitting in here today in Parliament in order to pass a piece of legislation to make it easier for us to increase our borrowing from offshore? Shouldn't that make us think, is this really a sustainable strategy for New Zealand as a whole to constantly run very large current account deficits, second worst in the OECD, and use all that offshore money to finance the New Zealand economy? Is that a sustainable economic strategy for our country? So we finance the current account deficit by borrowing, which this bill will facilitate more borrowing, and we do it by selling assets. Is that really a sustainable strategy? Now, of course, you can keep doing it for quite a long time. We know that. New Zealand has run chronic current account deficits. And so, you know, the government says this when we press them about it. They say, well, New Zealand's run a current account deficit for a long time. And that's true. You can keep doing it because we do have significant assets. We've still got a lot of land we haven't sold off. Probably about 90% of the land is still in New Zealand ownership. We still have some large corporates that haven't been sold off, but most of them have been. And we still have some facility to borrow further, as we're seeing with this bill. We can borrow more money from our offshore lenders, and they'll keep doing that for a while. Because, you know, we still have some space to borrow more. But is this really where we want to go? We want to say what we're going to do is max out our ability to borrow cash from offshore using things like this bill. We're going to max the credit card out. We're going to sell the house. We're going to sell off as many assets as we can in order to fund our current consumption, because that's what we're doing as our economic strategy as a country, and we have now done for a couple of decades. In order to fund current consumption, we are selling off our assets and borrowing from offshore. And this bill is the next step, the next logical step in that economic strategy by facilitating this offshore borrowing. I would argue that this is not a wise strategy for our country. And what we need from our government is a clear strategy for how they were going to get us out of this position. Now, the Greens have put up various proposals on exactly this issue, and it is the focus of our economic policy to rebalance the New Zealand economy. The government made certain noises in that direction, but then, you know, so far has failed to deal with the underlying problems. But this bill surely should be a moment where we look at ourselves and go, why are we standing in this House passing a bill in order to make it easier for us to borrow billions and billions of more offshore? Surely that should be a moment to stop and go, our economic strategy isn't working. When our economic strategy relies on offshore borrowing and selling our assets every year, year after year after year after year after year, this is not going to have a happy ending. And at some point, our offshore creditors are going to either dramatically increase the cost of borrowing for the New Zealand economy, or they're going to start actually restricting our access to credit. And at that point, there will be a significant adjustment. I would argue it is a much more sane strategy to start to make that adjustment ourselves now so that we can get out of the hole we're in, rather than leave it up to our creditors 10 years down the track who are going to make that adjustment for us, because they will. And that's the real choice we have. And what this bill does, it puts off the day when we have to make that choice, because it says, well, we'll facilitate these creditors lending us more money by giving them first dibs on the assets of the banks, which are the home mortgages. First dibs on the assets of the banks, and then the foreign lenders will lend us more money. Okay, that's true. It does put off the day of reckoning. That's true. But to think that this solves the underlying problem, I think, is extremely foolish. And if the government doesn't realise that, and it doesn't seem to, then we've got a problem and the government needs to change, because actually we need to deal with that underlying problem as reflected in the current account numbers, as reflected in the gross external debt numbers. And this bill doesn't do anything to do that. It simply enables us to keep borrowing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Maggie Berry.